Great. Okay, well, let's begin. I'm sure more people will be joining us through the course of this, but let's start straight away. As I've said, we've got a huge amount of information and thoughts to get across in the next 2.5 hours. So let's start by just introducing myself. I'm Isabel Russo, and I'm director of the Good Funeral Guide, along with Fran Hall and Jane Morgan. Would you both like to introduce yourselves now, Fran and Jane, before I continue?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to see you. I'm Jane Morgan, also director of the Good Funeral Guide, and I'm also London celebrant, and I'm also director of London's Coffin Club.
Thanks, Jane.
And you probably mostly know me. This I seem to be, like, unfortunately, the unwitting head of the Good Funeral Guide. Thank you all so much for giving up your bank holiday afternoons, because this is a really important topic, and anxious as I am about doing all the tech, I think it's essential that as many of us are involved in the conversation as possible. So welcome.
Thanks, Fran. And absolutely, as Fran says, it feels like an essential thing to be talking about. And thank you, everybody who's here, who's made it your priority to be with us on Bank Holiday Monday. A very wise decision, I think. And also a massive thank you to all of our speakers who've given us their time and experience pro bono to make today happen. So big thank you to all of you. We're so excited at the Good Funeral Guide to be able to provide this platform to support an essential ongoing conversation about how we can make funerals greener. With over 500,000 funerals taking place in the UK every year, decisions about the type of funeral that can either contribute to or mitigate against damage to our environment is essential. So without further ado, I think that we'll go straight over to Ken after I've just shared some housekeeping notes. Can you all hear me and see me okay? Just nod. Great. Thank you. So most importantly, we do have the chat facility alive for this Zoom meeting. However, probably a personal preference, I find it quite frustrating when there's chat going on between people whilst people are speaking. So what we would ask you to do is, as you're listening, if you have a question, a burning question that's forming, would you write your question into the chat? And then at the end, we're going to have a good Q&A session with all of the speakers, and we'll go through the questions and we'll put the questions to the speakers at the end of all the presentations. So yes, so don't use the chat to kind of talk with each other and answer each other's questions and open up new areas of conversation. Just use it to capture the question that you have for that particular speaker. Maybe put the speaker's name, actually, if the question is for somebody specific. That would be really helpful. Thank you. Everyone is on mute. The speakers will obviously unmute themselves. If you need to go away from the screen for a comfort break or get a cup of tea or answer the door, would you mind just turning your camera off, because it can be quite distracting to be able to see that activity, or an empty chair. Yes, so turn your camera off and then turn it back on again when you rejoin us. That would also be fabulous. Thank you. And that's it. That's it for housekeeping. That's it for welcomes. And I'd like to open with our first speaker, who is our patron, Ken West. He is widely recognised as the leading expert in the natural burial movement. Ken's had a 45-year career in bereavement services, with roles managing cemeteries, crematoria, and also working in local authorities. He's been involved in more than 100,000 funerals, and he created the world's first natural burial site in Carlisle almost 40 years ago. So we're delighted to have Ken opening our Go Greener conference. Thank you, Ken, and over to you.
Thank you, Isabel, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to be making these opening remarks, especially as we have a wealth of expertise and knowledge in the people that are going to speak today. To go greener is about change for the better. Change for the worse was my early experience as a 15-year-old in 1961. I was instructed to spray old cemeteries with newly introduced herbicides. The cemeteries had to be neat and tidy. Nobody realized that tidiness destroyed entire ecosystems. Barn owls at the top of the food chain disappeared from our cemetery and from similar places all over the UK. 20 years later, to reverse that loss, we created conservation areas in old cemeteries and the owls returned. It works. These old graves covered in wildflowers were so attractive that people asked to be buried in them. However, this wasn't possible because grave use wasn't allowed then and is still not allowed today. So Carlisle City Council had to use new land to create the world's first natural burial site in 1993. And it was advertised as a return to nature, purely to extend choice. There was no compunction or pressure on anybody to use the scheme. But that simple idea shook the funeral industry to its core. It didn't fit with the heavily promoted traditional funeral operated by, since Victorian times, the men in black. And they used the veneered chipboard coffin with plastic handles and the American-inspired embalming, which itself was only introduced in the 1960s when I first started work. And the traditional funeral also included the promotion of wreaths and the import of stone for memorials. However, many changes have taken place over the last 3 decades. Empowered by information and choice, the bereaved now request mourners not to wear black. The formal funeral is itself dying. They choose eco-coffins where they can, and these are becoming more and more available. And they've reduced flowers at funerals in favor of donations to charity. They consent to recycling the waste metal from cremation, hip joints, and various other bone splints. And most funeral services are now led by celebrants, many of whom are women. And that is almost the biggest change that I've experienced in the last 30 years, the way in which women have come into the death industry. More recently, world events have overtaken the funeral industry. The global crisis demands that we reduce carbon emissions. And if we think about carbon, then for me, incinerating bodies is absurd. Cutting grass on graves for 150 years is absurd. Shipping memorial stone, heavy granite from India and China to go onto graves is absurd. And air freighting flowers from places like Africa to go into wreaths is absurd. Even government legislation increased the amount of carbon. For instance, the Environmental Protection Act in the mid-1990s quadrupled gas consumption for cremation. And it was just an attempt to reduce cremation emissions. Even then, crematoria managers would talk to me and say that they felt there was no future for cremation. How would they feel today after the recent massive hike in energy costs? Neither did anyone really understand the pollution from incineration. And only in recent years have we fully understood the dangers of microparticulates. To conclude, to go greener, I believe that we need to continue to disseminate information and offer more choice. And that, I hope, is the objective of the afternoon. Thank you.
You're on mute, Isabel.
Fabulous, Ken. Thank you so much. So insightful, concise, succinct, and informative. Thank you for the wealth of your experience. Our next speaker is Natalie Bennett. She isn't with us right now, so we're going to move straight on to our next contribution, which is from John Halliday and Alex Otel Torres. So their talk is The View from Greenpeace, and is on the subject of environmental campaigning. We're going to have lessons from the past from John and hope for the future from Alex. John is a human resources specialist for an international development and humanitarian NGO. And John has volunteered with Greenpeace for 15 years. He's coordinator of the Canterbury Voluntary Group, campaigning to save our oceans and forests and to stop climate change. And Alex is a postgraduate researcher at the University of Bristol, where he also teaches sustainable development. And prior to joining Greenpeace as a youth speaker, he volunteered with Fast Track Cities. So very much looking to hear from you both. Over to you two.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and so nice to meet you all. Thank you very much for inviting Alex and myself to this conference. Needless to say, neither Alex or I really know much about burials or funerals or the funeral industry, so we can't contribute much on the technical aspects of what you do. But it was really fascinating to hear Ken talk about the changes that have been made, obviously changes that you have instigated, Ken, which is a fascinating story, in your industry since you started over the last 40 or 50 years, as you described it. And you talk about change, and Greenpeace is all about making, instigating, perpetuating and encouraging change to protect our environment, but to protect our natural world, to protect our planet and all the life forms that depend upon it. And to make change, we need to take action of some sort. So I just want to spend a few minutes talking about action. And I'm going to begin with a quote that was made by our executive director, Jean Sauvin, a couple of years ago, about action. He said that action is at the heart of what Greenpeace does. We take action when we believe something is wrong. It's that simple. We physically intervene to stop an immediate environmental wrong at the scene of the crime. The key to direct action from our point of view is that it's always non-violent and we never run away. When the police come and they arrest us, we always stand our ground and we always defend our action in a court of law. So I just use that because the notion of taking action of one form or another, and particularly what we call non-violent direct action, is key to the way Greenpeace operates. And I would hope that many of you will have read about our exploits on some occasions in the newspapers and seen us on the TV. We don't deliberately take action to get ourselves arrested, but that does happen from time to time. Rather, the point of taking action is to bear witness. It's part of what we call bearing witness. And I'll just very quickly tell you about the first time we ever did this, back in 1971. We were based in Vancouver. We'd only just adopted the name of Greenpeace. And our major concern at that time, as was many people's concern, was the preponderance and increasing numbers of nuclear weapons, and particularly the likelihood of international nuclear war. We decided that one thing we really needed to do was to try and stop the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, particularly by America in the North Atlantic at the island of Amchitka. So we did something rather bold. I wasn't there, of course, I was only 13 at the time. But we hired an old fishing boat, and we planned to sail it right into the testing site of President Nixon's bombs off the island of Amchitka. Now, the danger with that, the very obvious danger, is that we could have been blown to smithereens. We didn't really want that to happen. So the important thing was that we got maximum publicity for what we were doing to try and change the situation and just demonstrate that here are 12 crazy people, all men, unfortunately, given these enlightened times and our own enlightened approach to things, but all men. But here are 12 crazy men prepared to get themselves blown up to protest, to bear witness against what President Nixon is doing in the North Pacific Ocean. We weren't killed, obviously. We weren't blown up. We went viral, as we're called today. We didn't use that phrase in those days, but we became headline news. We were heard about all around the planet, and our message was heard. And this is one of the key things. This is one of the key lessons I want to draw from this, that if you make enough noise, if you're bold enough, if you're daring enough, in fact, if you're downright foolhardy enough, you can get noticed and people will listen to your cause. And the second lesson I would draw from this was something that actually happened during the voyage itself. when we were stopped by a US Coast Guard. As you can imagine, the Canadian and the US Coast Guard were on the lookout for what we were doing. They were following us quite closely. And we were stopped by the Coast Guard, the USS Confidence. And while these officers of the Confidence were inspecting our boat, we were passed a message from the crew of the Confidence. And this is what the message said. This is written by enlisted men in the 1970s. Due to the situation we are in, we, the crew of the Confidence, feel that what you are doing is for the good of all mankind. If our hands weren't tied by these military bonds, we would be in the same position you are in, if it were at all possible. Good luck. We are behind you 100%. And that was signed by 18 members of the crew of a US Coast Guard vessel. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'd got a message like that right out of the blue when I'm in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, worried if I'm going to make it till tomorrow morning, I think that would have raised my spirits somewhat. And I mention it because this is the key thing. You never know where you are going to find allies. And more people than you believe are going to be on your side. And more people than you'd anticipated are going to support what you are doing. And in those times when you think, this is crazy, what the heck am I doing? And both Alex and I have been in those situations many times. There is always an external voice, a real live person, a real live institution who will say to you, yes, you are doing the right thing. You are doing the right thing. And it's that sort of thing that keeps you going and makes you know you are doing the right thing. So I'm almost out of time here. So let me very quickly just give you a few pointers on campaigning, how we see it working, the key efforts, the key points to make a campaign work. First of all, demonstrate the facts and justify the objective. Make sure that what you are saying is accurate, is correct, that your objectives are logically and purposefully drawn from the observations you have made. You've got to be able to justify your argument, in short. The next thing to do is then directly confront the perpetrators of the environmental wrong, just as we did on the island of Amchitka, just as we've done with oil companies like Shell and BP and supermarkets like Tesco who are destroying our rainforests. Talk to them politely, persuasively, but determinedly. Show them the facts. The next step is to get other people aware of what is happening. This is the broader aspect of bearing witness. Get publicity, cause publicity for what you're campaigning for, and then obtain public support. Show that there is public support for what you're doing. And we do that in very simple ways by having street petitions, asking people to write postcards to the Prime Minister, whatever is necessary, to show A, that we are not alone, and B, that the cause has massive public support. Continue persuading people, continue talking, and only as a last resort do we take direct action, non-violent direct action. And this is what Martin Luther King said about that. Non-violent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. So I'm going to stop there. Very few lessons to be learned in such a short time, but I think they're all very important. And I'll conclude with just a couple of points on what we've managed to achieve through a mixture of talking, of demonstrating our facts, of taking non-violent direct action. So, for example, our very first campaign, which I just described, was to produce an end to atmospheric nuclear testing. Didn't get rid of nuclear weapons completely, but my God, it was a good first step. We've managed to organize a ban on toxic waste exports to less developed countries, a moratorium on commercial whaling, a 50-year moratorium on Antarctic exploitation. We set up our own exploration or scientific camp in Antarctica 20 years ago, along with the Americans, the French, the Russians, the English, and persuaded the various countries who were wanting to develop the Antarctic that no, commercial exploitation was not advisable. Scientific, fine, but let's have a ban on or moratorium on Antarctic exploitation. So there's just a list of a few of the successes we've had. We go on having successes. I know Alex has got a few more to tell you about, so I'll pass over to him. Thank you.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Isabel, Jane, and Fran for having us today here. I'm just gonna send a link on the chat. I'll mention what it's about in a minute. So yeah, I'll just take on from where John has left it and talk a bit about where we're at today. and about hope for the future, hopefully. So today the science is very clear. The world has only a narrow chance of limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And according to the latest IPCC report, we're falling far behind on making the changes necessary to make this possible, to transform the global economies to achieve this. Today, the effects of climate change are already everywhere. In the last couple of years, cyclones have devastated the Philippines, forest fires in Europe have covered cities in thick, polluting smoke, catastrophic floods have turned lives upside down in several areas of England and Western Germany. Wildfires are raging out of control, reducing mighty forests to ash. Our oceans are warming and becoming more acidic, which causes mass growth die-offs and the loss of breeding grounds for sea creatures. Delicate ecosystems that are home to insects, plants, and animals are struggling to adapt quickly enough to the changing climate, and this is putting 1 million species at risk of extinction. This means that our food security, our health, and our quality of life are all under threat. Billions of people are already struggling to cope with climate change, and as usual, it's the poorest that have been hit hardest. This all sounds very bleak, and it's very easy to become discouraged and feel overwhelmed. But at Greenpeace, we believe that if we all get together and with the right tools, we can overcome or at least mitigate these challenges. In the last 2 years, we've achieved many victories in Greenpeace. For instance, last April, we welcomed a ban on bottom trawling in the Dogger Bank, a UK marine protected area. In 2021, a planned oil field in the North Sea was put on hold. The City of London made its ultra-low emission zone 18 times bigger than it was. In 2020, BP committed to significantly cut its oil production and boost renewable energy. And the UK government announced it will ban sales of new petrol and diesel cars and vans by 2030, which is a full decade earlier than planned initially. And all these are the result of Greenpeace's campaigning. We've also seen other activist groups such as Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future form and gain momentum, and they've been doing some amazing work. For instance, in May 2019, we saw the UK government become the first in the world to declare the climate emergency, and this again was the result of massive protests and activism. And since many other countries and regional governments have followed suit. At Greenpeace, we're currently working on 5 different campaigns that tackle some of the challenges that we're facing today. These are the oil and gas campaign, which aims to reduce fossil fuels, ocean sanctuaries, which has the goal of protecting 30% of our waters, food and forests, which addresses the link between deforestation and industrial production of meat, palm oil, and soya, industrial fishing, which, as I mentioned earlier, seeks to ban bottom trawling everywhere, and plastic pollution. So as part of this last campaign, plastic pollution, we're now running the Big Plastic Count. So we're all doing our bit to recycle, but we're still choking in plastic. And the amount of plastic that we use today is projected to double by 2040. So what we're doing is ask the public to sign up to the Big Plastic Count. All you have to do, if you do sign up, is tally your plastic waste during the week between the 16th and the 22nd of May. And at the end of this period, just submit the results on our website. Once these are all in, we'll get an accurate picture of the UK's plastic problem, and we'll use the results to push the government to commit to reduce the single-use plastic by 50% by 2025, by switching to reusable options that work for everyone, and the ban on sending our waste to other countries. So that's the link that I sent on the chat earlier. And well, just to finish, as Ken was, he put this much more eloquently than I would do, but the funeral sector has changed a lot in the last few decades, both in the UK and elsewhere. Many people have embraced cremations as a more economic way of saying goodbye to their loved ones. And I believe that this demonstrates that people are willing to embrace change, necessary change, and beneficial change a lot of the time. So despite taboos surrounding death and entrenched traditions, moving to natural burials is a concept that attracts many people, and especially young people. I mean, it's something that I have discussed many times with friends and colleagues. So as we transform our societies and economies to make them kinder to the planet, the funeral sector has a lot of potential for good. And that's all from me. Thanks for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Alex. And thank you, John. A really inspiring call to arms, although obviously that's not a fortunate way of putting it. And a lovely story about finding allies in the most unexpected places. Really, it gave me goosebumps. And Alex, you might like to join in a bit later when we talk about memorialization and floral tributes and use of oasis and all of those things. Thank you both very much. So we now move on to a conversation or a chat or a presentation about greenwashing from James Leadham. The act of greenwashing is a growing phenomenon. Companies shout very loudly about being environmentally conscious for marketing purpose, whilst in truth, they make very little, if any, sustainable effort. So how do we tell the difference? And speaking on this topic, I'm delighted to welcome James. He spent the last 20 years working with landowners across the UK to set up sustainable natural burial grounds. He's been a trustee of the Natural Death Centre and has worked with the Ministry of Justice and the Institute of Cemetery and Cremation Management to produce guidance for the operators of natural burial grounds. He is an active Good Funeral Guide member, and he's keenly attuned to spotting greenwash in the funeral sector. So thank you, James.
Thank you. Hi, hello everybody. I'm brand new to Zoom, so you'll have to bear with me. I'd like to share my screen with you. So let's give this a go. Is that working? Hopefully. So, right, I think I'm set up now. We're living in an age of misinformation, led astray by false statements and fake news. Greenwashing is just what you see here. It's an attempt at green brainwashing. It's marketing and PR spin used to deceive us into thinking that something is ecologically sound without actually delivering. Companies know that consumer appetite for green stuff is growing, and they're desperate for a slice of the action. So the temptation for them is to make themselves appear greener than they actually are. They use ambiguous, loose terms and buzzwords and splash them around to promote their goods and services. So how does this relate to the funeral sector? Well, let's start with the coffin. Eco coffins are increasingly popular, but is a coffin actually eco if it's shipped from the other side of the world? And we know that shipping is notoriously polluting. Is a green funeral still green when relatives have flown in or traveled from far away? Again, we should be aiming for as few miles as possible. And is a biodegradable plastic body bag even rational if it won't biodegrade in the conditions that exist in the grave? What's the point of it? Because when they're burnt in the cremator, they turn into toxic pollution and CO2. Are florists aware that so-called bio versions of florist foam won't decompose on a compost heap? It needs biologically active landfill conditions in order to break down. And even then, a lingering 10% of it will refuse to go. And what's the point of an electric hearse if the bearers come in separate cars? But all of this all of this pales into insignificant compared with carbon offsetting. Paying for others to reduce emissions or absorb CO2 to compensate for your own continued discharge. This could be the biggest scam in our generation. Carbon trading sells permits to pollute in return for money. It's astonishing that this is even legitimate. The figures, claimed measurements are wildly inaccurate, impossible to verify, and open to abuse. It's usually done by paying a broker who'll have a range of projects like wind farms, cleaner, more efficient cooking stoves for Sudan, sponsoring wetland and forest preservation projects, and of course, tree planting. But carbon offsets can be bought so cheaply that there's no incentive for emitters to invest in cleaner technology. The whole market is riddled with corruption and injustice, and there's been no perceptible reduction in greenhouse gas emissions since it began. Typically, greenwashing is employed by businesses with something to hide. In the funeral sector, we immediately think of crematoria. One new arrival in the direct cremation scene has a website that absolutely screams greenwash. These are some of their claims. Can the impact of a cremation really be counteracted by planting a tree? Let's have a look. They want you to think that planting one sapling, or as they prefer to say, tree, will offset the carbon from one cremation. But will it? We're told that each cremation emits 250 kilograms of carbon. The Woodland Trust estimates that one tree in a UK woodland absorbs about 250 kilograms of carbon over its lifetime. So on the face of it, that balances. But a sapling will take decades to start to absorb any significant amount of carbon dioxide, by which time millions more CO2 spewing cremations will have taken place. It's a game of catch up that these saplings will never win, and we don't have decades to spare. Also, what are the chances of this little sapling becoming a mature tree? According to an expert report on European forestry, only 13 to 55% of saplings reach maturity. That figure assumes standard planting methods, correct protection, and attentive aftercare, which isn't always the case. And many carbon offset schemes operate in much harsher climates where survival rates are lower still, and planting methods can include dropping seed balls from aircraft. You can begin to see how the figures don't add up. And sadly, there's more. There is quite possibly no net gain to be made by planting trees. Low-cost farmland in the UK is being purchased by big business to plant trees for carbon offset schemes. But grassland is already a great carbon sink, sequestering carbon into the soil via plant roots. Using this land to plant trees will diminish the grass cover and cut the carbon capture previously achieved by the grass. Where is the gain? In the end, everything becomes a bit of a fantasy. Another favorite of the greenwashing brigade is to quote out of context from academic studies. For example, promoters of resumation refer to some very odd results from a Dutch report that says water cremation had the lowest overall impact on the environment of all end-of-life options. That just didn't sound right to me, so I decided to contact the author of the study. It turns out that her report does not include all end-of-life options. Low-impact natural burial, for example, was missing. Standard Dutch burials fared worst because they typically include the extra impact of exhuming and reburying bones after a period of years, which is not what we do in the UK. The report also assumed that only burials would include a memorial stone, which we know isn't right. Additionally, the author pointed out that life cycle cost analysis, the method that she used, favors an industrial process like resumation. All of this is essential context that the consumer should be told. Another report that favors cremation over burial is based on fictitious funeral scenarios dreamt up by the client, which render the results meaningless. But reports like that give rise to headline claims like this: a cremation is greener than a burial. Again, no substantiation is provided to enable this claim to be interrogated. So what regulations are there to control misinformation? Well, if you suspect a company is using greenwash, check it against the CMA guidance and the ASA CAP code. If it fails, then we should be reporting it to trading standards. And one last thing, we too can be a little bit complicit in this trickery when it suits us, allowing ourselves to swallow the greenwash because what they're actually supplying is what we want at the time. We can persuade ourselves that just this once won't make a big difference. And after all, they plant a tree, don't they? But no, that's just not okay. So please be vigilant, challenge what you read, ask for substantiation, go through the small print, question the report, and don't swallow the greenwash. Let me leave you with this thought. Nature already has the answer. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, James. Gosh, that was a really thought-provoking presentation and a difficult balance of wonderful and depressing to see those facts being gathered in the way that John was saying we must gather our facts. So thank you for being up there, gathering those thoughts and being able to hold, you know, that what that brings. Thank you.
Okay.
Gosh, on we go with our programme. So our next speaker, Brendan Day, is the founder and director of the Greener Globe Funeral Awards, which is a new, innovative and independently audited framework through which funeral businesses can identify areas for change and move forwards in a more sustainable way of operating. Brendan has many years of experience in the bereavement sector, and he actually began his working career reporting to our first speaker and patron, Ken West. So Brendan, thank you, and over to you.
First of all, can I just check to see, can you see my slides as well? Because I'm pretty new to this wonderful technology.
Yeah, we can see you fine and hear you fine as well. Thank you, Brendan.
Great, see the slides. Well, first of all, I've got to say.
Oh, I can't actually, sorry, no, hold on. I misheard you. We can't see the slides. We can see you, but we can't see your slides.
Right, let me just check this. Can you switch me on then, Fran, as a presenter or not?
You should be able to share your screen. Have you clicked the green arrow at the bottom, Brendan?
Let me have a look. Share screen. Gosh.
Gives you various options. If it's a PowerPoint, just go to the PowerPoint one. Otherwise, share your desktop.
Great. Something's
There you go.
happening. Here we go. Fab.
How's about that?
That's it. That's perfect.
Great. Well, first of all, I would have to say thanks for the invite. And listening to Ken, I've got to say, in 40 years, it's got to be the most exciting time I think I've ever known in this sector, and I'm really looking forward, to the next few years. Well, you're probably aware of the phrase that there are only two certainties in life: death and taxes. Well, I feel relatively confident now that there are two other certainties in the bereavement sector, and that's that it must move to a more sustainable way of working, and I think it will. And the reason I'm confident about these changes is because the drivers that are pushing the sector towards greener outcomes. And if we just take a look at a couple of those to begin with. Now, the first one's from government. And they do make the point that these recent messages at the Environmental Stewardship's first presentation, that the sector throughout the UK, businesses have got to rise to the challenge now. And those that do rise to the challenge are going to have market advantage. And picking up on James's point, unfortunately, this is also driving greenwashing. But businesses are going to have to rise to this challenge, and no one person or organisation or government policy has the answer. And this is going to be across society. It's going to be up to those in the various sectors to deliver the change which is necessary to ensure that we do have a more sustainable outcome. So I do believe it is going to be up to everybody in our sector to deliver the change which is necessary. And in addition to the government pushing change, there is also a growing appetite amongst the public for greener alternatives. And we've seen this, and companies such as Waitrose and Deloitte, as you can see from these statistics, they are finding that from their consumers. And again, as I say, this is a double-edged sword. For good companies out there, they will want to deliver the change for their consumers. For bad companies out there, unfortunately, we need as much information as possible to stop the greenwashing. There are some really difficult decisions which have to be made, and to find independent evidence is really difficult. But those drivers are clearly there. And only this week, I saw this recent survey at an event held by the Faunus Group, who are developing their human composting offering to the public. I think it really illustrates the point here that 77% of the public involved in a survey involving 1,500 people. And this was a representative survey of the UK. 77% of the public will consider more environmentally friendly means of final disposal. Now, this is hugely significant. Anything above 50% in a survey is significant. So again, 77% who will be prepared to adopt new ways of disposing of the dead. I think that really is something. So combining those drivers, encouraging business to change, and that pushing on an open door with the public, then greener funeral outcomes should be able to proceed. There's no reason why greener outcomes should not progress. So initially, when I was thinking about how the sector could be encouraged to move forward, I did think about crematoria, an award scheme for crematoria, because that's been my background for 40 years. However, they will not be the future, or they may not be the future. And from my experience of 37 years working in the bereavement sector, it was clear to me that it's funeral directors who are the gatekeepers. If funeral directors can become more active, offering greater choice to the bereaved, it appears then that greener market can start to flourish. And not only that, but by offering that greater choice to families, in turn, that will encourage their suppliers to offer a greater range of green products. Downstream as well, it will then push private companies, local authorities and others to invest in greener ways of disposing of the dead. Now, I don't know what they are yet, and I'm not sure any of us really know, but there are these new means of disposal, whether it be reservation, whether it be composting, that are being put forward, and we definitely need more independent studies in those areas in order that we can look at and decide which way the sector has to go. But that is why I decided to look at funeral directors as a means of altering the sector. So I've been creating this Greener Globe Funeral Awards to recognise those pioneers amongst funeral directors who are already delivering excellent sustainable services, whilst also encouraging the majority, the mainstream funeral directors, many of whom will only just be starting their journey. I've been developing this standard for 18 months, and the journey so far has involved funeral directors, including Leverton's and Port of Stourbridge, who I'm very grateful for because they completed the first bronze awards to see how it could work. I've also involved SAFE and the NAFD, Cardiff University and Sustainable Wales have also had inputs into the process, along with SEM Services, who deliver ISO 14001 accreditation, along with other standards. And it is they who will audit each application for one of the Greener Globe Funeral Awards. Because again, picking up on previous speakers, the GGFA is fundamentally an evidence-based award scheme. Each application and renewal requires the submission of supporting evidence, which is audited by SEM Services. Commencing with the Bronze Award, this is about changing the culture of some organisations. It requires the leadership of the company to adopt our trusted environmental policy and provide evidence as to how staff are going to be made aware of it and what is required of them to deliver it. The Silver Award is at the heart of this whole process. It's a sustainability audit, requiring the funeral director to examine 16 areas of their business, some generic, such as energy usage, recycling, waste, water consumption. But importantly, others are sector specific. Advice given to clients on such things as coffins, as floral tributes, as memorials, their secondary spends. Where are these items coming from? Mortuary usage and vehicles. The completion of this audit with evidence of the findings is submitted and checked prior to a Silver Award being granted. In effect, the Silver Award provides the funeral director with an important resource, a document highlighting not only good practice, but perhaps more importantly, the areas which require improvement. The Gold Award is gained by the funeral director utilising the sustainability audit data and creating and submitting a rapid improvement plan. A list of those areas where the funeral director can make quick gains to reduce the impact of the business on the environment. In other words, it's about harvesting the low-hanging fruit. But that work, again, it must be evidence-based. They must complete the audit and show what work is being done. The final award is the Platinum, again using the sustainability audit, but creating a long-term improvement plan to address the larger issues. For example, improved insulation of a property, more efficient refrigerators, replacing existing vehicles with hybrids, electric. This can be spread over several years. However, each time the award is renewed, evidence of progress must be submitted. That has been a brief summary of the Greener Globe Funeral Awards. The development website is at the address on your screen. If you would like further information, please take a look, or please contact me. I'll be happy to involve you in the development of this. If we are continuing to develop it, we hope to launch it later this year with the help of funeral directors to make it meaningful for the sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan, for that excellent presentation. It's really exciting to know that that work is going ahead. I'm sure that everyone has lots of questions, certainly following Brendan's presentation and all of the presentations so far. So do remember to write any questions that you have in the chat box, and we shall pick them up later in the Q&A session. Thank you. So moving on. We're now going to hear from Sarah Jones. Sarah is the founder and director of Full Circle Funerals, an award-winning funeral business founded in 2016 that's now expanded to 5 branches across Yorkshire with a partner business in Greater Manchester. And Full Circle Funerals in Leeds recently became the first funeral director in the UK to achieve B Corp certification. And Sarah's now going to share some of her thoughts on this journey, ongoing journey towards sustainability. Thank you, Sarah.
Well, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. So I'm Sarah. I'm going to start with a really clear disclaimer, which is in contrast to everyone else that we've just heard from. I am very, very far from an expert on sustainability or anything green. So what I'm hopefully going to bring is a normal, non-expert person, an everyday funeral director, just trying to do the right thing. And it's been really interesting, particularly to listen to James, because I've been on all of that journey myself. So I'm going to kind of share what we've done in the hope that it might make it feel a little bit more accessible for some people, and just extend an invitation to anybody who thinks we may be able to help, again, as an everyday person rather than an expert, because we really are not that. So I'm going to screen share, hopefully. So I'm hoping you guys can now see some pretty flowers. Are we good?
Yes, that's great.
Okay, super. So yeah, I'm going to share our journey. So I'm going to talk a little bit to start with about green funeral options, because that's where we started. Then about scope 1 and 2, because that was the next big step in the journey for us. And then, as Isabel mentioned, at that point, I decided to go for B Corp certification, which is a little broader than just sustainability, but there was, I guess I'll share my reasons for that. Then last year, I had a big and scary epiphany about the importance of the supply chain. And then I'm just going to share, I guess, where I'm at, and maybe some of you would like to help. So the first steps for us were, as Isabel said, so we opened in 2016, and we were all about choices. So before we opened, we were really keen that we understood more sustainable funeral choices so that we could share those with the people that we supported. I quite quickly, in our early research, couldn't really find the answer. And actually, it's really heartening that James also doesn't feel that the research holds the answer, because I wasn't sure if it was just me not quite getting it, or actually whether the answer just really wasn't there. So I found myself thinking, well, do you know what? I need to just take the information that I can find and then just use my common sense, and then try and decide what I think I'm suggesting to people, conscious of the fact that I don't want to be telling families that we're supporting that actually we don't really have the data and it's all a bit of a mess. I want to be able to give them some sort of steer and recommendation where I can. We then absolutely went down the tree planting. So for the last 5 years, we have planted a tree for every funeral that we have supported a family with. I haven't done it because it wasn't so much about offsetting the carbon. It was more about rewilding, reforestation, creating habitats, supporting biodiversity in a local ancient forest, but very much fell into the tree planting is the answer trap about 5 years ago. And we continue to plant those trees, but I think I now have a better understanding of what the place of that is, I suppose, in our sustainability journey. Then I started to scrutinise the data a little bit more and started to think, actually, I kind of want the answer. I want to understand. I want to be able to do a little bit more. And in order to do that, I guess what I found myself having to do is really accept and face the uncertainty and really step up to that and say, well, that's okay, because if I accept the uncertainty and I know where the uncertainty is, maybe I can be part of the solution. So For us, one of the first steps was trying to understand our scope 1 and 2. And as part of that, we wrote an environmental care policy, which I would be really happy to share with anybody. Again, big caveat, not written by an expert, but just some basic ideas to share with the team about how we could be as sustainable as possible, at least consider the environment in our choices. To my mind, it can be split in 3. So the first is funerals. So supporting families to understand more sustainable funeral choices and sharing that information, both with people we support, but also more widely with the communication channels that we have. The second was thinking about our business. So, you know, our buildings and cars, I guess, broadly speaking. So the non-funeral care specific stuff. And then thinking about the time that we're spending within communities and trying to focus some of that time on things that we think benefit the environment. We started measuring stuff. And we've been measuring our waste, our water, our utilities, and then calculating our greenhouse gas emissions for the last 4 years or so. And my initial thought was I was going to set targets for reduction. So my plan was I will measure scope 1 and 2, and then I will work hard on my my reduction targets. So we were doing things like using those little machines to work out how much energy my computer used and how much energy the kettle used. And, you know, that was kind of where I was going to focus my energies. So I'm going to come back to that, but I'm going to digress because at that point I heard about B Corp, and I decided that I wanted to be part of the B Corp movement. So some of you may have heard of it. For those of you that haven't, B Corps are they describe themselves as a new type of business that balances purpose with profit. The driving principle behind B Corps is that we actually want to change some of the systemic problems in society. Business needs to be part of that, and business needs to step up and take its responsibilities seriously. So B Corp, the B Corp movement, which is global, it is run by a charity called B Lab. And what they're trying to do is create a large business community, which is using business as a force for good and balancing purpose with profit. So we did it. The reason we did it is it's not just about the environment. So there are 5 pillars, the environment of which is one. It's very aligned with our purpose generally, but it's also an incredible way to learn. So for example, from the sustainability pillar of the impact assessment, I learned an awful lot about how to begin to understand Full Circle's impact on the environment and how to start trying to step up to taking my responsibility more seriously. So it provides a structure, it's externally assessed. And what I really wanted to do is be part of the B Corp, B Local movement. And a big thing, which will probably resonate with a lot of people in the room, I kind of wanted to put funeral directors in the space too, and say, well, do you know what, you might not classically think of funeral directors as a B Corp, but do you know what, we are. And funeral care professionals have just as much right and responsibility to be in the space as anyone else. So yes, I was thinking about my 1 and 2, and I was measuring my kettle, and I was thinking, how am I going to make my reductions? And then I went to a presentation at the Harrogate the Climate Change Festival, and I saw this slide. And the person on the stage, who was an expert, is an expert, kind of said, do you know what, this scope 1 and scope 2 stuff's really good and all, but you know, you really need to have a think about your scope 3. And if you're really focusing on 1 and 2, you're kidding yourself. You need to have a think about your supply chain. And I took a deep breath and I went, oh, that's really big and scary, but okay. So I stopped measuring my kettle and I started thinking about my supply chain. As a result of that, we've written an impact purchasing plan, which articulates what's going to drive our purchasing as much as possible, and a process that we're going to follow to try and purchase most ethically. That's led me on an interesting journey, which has involved me, because as you can imagine, we've got kind of non-funeral care related stuff in our supply chain. So that's stuff like office equipment and computers. And then there is funeral care specific stuff in our supply chain. I'm happy to be challenged, but to my mind, that's the different methods by which a body may be disposed of. And that's some of the really big funeral specific stuff like coffins. So I've tried to begin to understand what that might look like and how I might be able to understand and therefore purchase more ethically. So that has been interesting. I've been at that for a really long time and I'm not making very quick progress. But what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to tell people who ask me what the most sustainable choice is. I want to have the facts so that I can tell people who are interested. And I also want to understand whether there's anything that I can immediately exclude from my supply chain because there is a better alternative that will immediately have an impact on my scope 3 without that having a detrimental impact on the people who we support. So I'm currently in the process of, again, it's been going on a long time, but working with an organisation called Planet Mark. And what we are talking about is a project which would involve them understanding, using a supply chain expert to understand. I have identified 10 coffins, which I feel are probably the most frequently used. And what we're looking to do, or what they're looking to do, is a project where they could use specialists to understand what the impact is of these different coffins, and then that can be made publicly available for manufacturers, for funeral directors, and for the public, so that that can be shared. So that is me. The only thing I would just like to say to end, I'm sorry I've run over by a whole minute, I apologise, is the issue with this piece of work, which I think is really important, as you can tell, is that I think it's really important that it's not funded by anyone in particular, because it immediately starts to get a bit complicated. And that's quite challenging because obviously this work costs a lot of money. So my current thought, but I'm happy for people to email with much better suggestions, is that maybe this could be crowdfunded. I don't want to own this data. I want the data to be publicly available to anybody who wants to use it to do better and be able to put the information out so that people can use that to inform their choices. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah. Really informative and clearly explained. You're clearly immersing yourself in the world to become an expert, even if you think you're not one now. Thank you very much indeed. And any questions for Sarah, do put them in the chat. So we're now going to move on to 5 short discussions on aspects of the funeral journey where we need to be engaging with more enlightened choices. And our first discussion is about what to do with the body, cremation, burial, or what. In this discussion, Fran will be talking with Julie Dunk, CEO of the Institute of Cemetery and Crematoria Management, and also with Ken West, who we've already heard from. We do hope to be joined by Howard Pickard from Resumation, but he's travelling, so his internet connection is tricky. Howard, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Currently in the station, so it's a bit of background noise, so I'll just unmute when it's appropriate.
Okay, so let's get this discussion off the ground. Over to you, Fran, before Howard has to jump on his train.
Thanks, Isabel. And Ken, if you'd like to unmute yourself, and you and Julie and Howard, hopefully without the station background. We've got 10 minutes, guys, to talk about the merits and demerits of burial versus cremation. I'm just going to open it up for either of you to start. Julie, ladies first. Have you got any comments about the impact and the choices that people make?
Yeah, thanks, Fran. It's a really difficult subject, I think, and a lot of the arguments that we've heard today, a lack of knowledge, a lack of independent research doesn't really help. I think if we weigh it up, we've got, Isabel said at the start, we've got over 500,000 deaths a year, and those bodies need to be disposed of somehow. And we've got to do that in a way that protects the environment. Now, cremation, when cremation was first started, it was seen as a clean, the whole language around it was scientific and it was cleansing and all of that. And now we've gone sort of full circle on that. Sorry, Sarah, it's a usual title, but we have gone there, and it's no longer seen as the clean alternative, but it's very efficient. It's very effective if it's run properly. And I think, although incineration needs to be phased out, we're not quite at the point where we can replace cremation with something that we can use. Sorry, my cat's joining in. Something that we can use to replace the large scale, if you like, of disposals that we have. Can we really accommodate 500,000 natural burials? I'd like to think so, but in reality, can we? Especially in light of the Environment Agency just publishing new guidelines for requiring permits for any new cemetery developments. You know, there is concern that burial is bad for the environment and certainly for water. So, you know, they're very limited on where we can put new cemeteries, for example. So, you know, natural burial is fantastic, you know, no doubt about that, but can it replace cremation at this stage? Or are there other methodologies that are going to come in and will be able to replace the mass scale of cremation?
Ken, what are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are that, first of all, that if we had grave reuse available to us, we can now go back into Victorian cemeteries virtually all over the country. Millions of graves are sitting there. Now, in saying that, there would be no point in doing that unless we were maintaining those cemetery areas to protect the wildlife which is already there, because most of them are already nature reserves effectively. And what we're tending to forget with regards to burial and cremation is that when you choose a natural burial, you're also increasing biodiversity by huge amounts, potentially. You're creating new life because you're creating an environment. And we know, for instance, that the natural burial site at Carlisle, we had hares, hedgehogs, deer, all sorts of things. The numbers just went up exponentially when we started to do that. So I think that the burial has an option, but only if we're given this burial reuse. And then we operate those cemetery areas, the old cemetery areas, as if they were urban natural burial, for want of better words. You could call it conservation burial, you could call it anything. So if the government gave us that ability, we know in fact that we could certainly progressively increase. Why I say that is that when I started in 1961, only 35% of people were cremated. So all we're doing is reversing back to 1961 to actually have 2/3 burials, 1/3 cremations. Cremation has not gone on forever. And so the option is there, but it would need to start and it would need to be progressive.
Thank you. Howard, are you still with us? Can you hear us? And have you got a contribution?
Yes, I'm here. And it's been very, very interesting to hear the various presentations. Being somewhat of an outsider to the industry, it's always learning. And from our point of view, we don't see the introduction of resumation as directly replacing various other forms, but just adding a choice to start with. But then from the feedback we get, and yes, the figures always need scrutiny and further development, and the process needs further development. But we feel that where people are seeing cremation as an option, then due to the nature of the funeral event, the immediacy of the disposition and that process in terms of the funeral, then resumation offers an alternative which undoubtedly has a lower impact on the environment than flame cremation. So we're not professing, and I'm not sure where James, I don't dispute, but it's a bit like media, that where he's referring to selected perhaps, and how it came across that we're saying it's the best of all. I wouldn't actually support that, you know, claim that we say that, but it is an alternative, and through the information, the contact we get from the public regularly, every day, members of the public who hear of resumation saying, this is a type of process, this is a form of disposition at end of life that I would be interested in. So we see resumation amongst many new forms as many existing forms, as Ken says, going back to the 1960s, why not? But the fundamental should be reducing that impact on the environment, and that's what we see resumation as helping with.
Thank you, Howard. I think, you know, the message is coming across loud and clear is that information, people need facts, don't they? People need information so they can make informed decisions. And there is an absence of clear guidance for bereaved families who will have probably not given too much thought about the environmental impact of their funeral. Being caught up in the approaching death or the sudden death of someone that you love, unfortunately, the environmental levels of your choices of coffin or your choices of body disposal are not going to be at the forefront of your mind. So I think it's up to the sector, and that encompasses the cremation and burial sector, as well as the gatekeepers. I think Brendan referred to the funeral directors who are offering and supporting bereaved families through their decision making to have facts at their fingertips. And it seems to me that those facts are what is missing. So I am going to finish this very, very rapid gallop through the options of burial and cremation, but I think we could have done 3 days on this subject and still have not run out of things to say. But I'm conscious that we are now into the next 10-minute conversation, so I'm going to hand back to Isabel briefly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much all for your contributions, and especially thank you, Howard, for talking to us from in transit. I should imagine there hasn't ever been somebody talking about resummation in that particular corner of that train. Okay, so Jane, our very own Jane, will be facilitating the next conversation, which is around choosing a coffin. So Jane, did you start a coffin club? I should know this.
I'll say in a minute. First of all, so Ellen Musgrove's going to join us, and Gordon Tully from Respect Shrouds was going to be joining us. I don't think he's here. So it'd be great to, I think, Sarah, you mentioned the 10 different coffins that are most regularly bought from the customers that come to you. So it'd be great to hear from you if you don't mind. I was asked a couple of things about that. So yes, we'll have a gallop now through coffin choices, and as everyone has said, with over 500,000 deaths and funerals, there's a lot of coffins to be chosen, and it's really interesting to see what people are thinking about when they're choosing a coffin. And to answer your question, Isabel, I set up Coffin Club in London, but not Coffin Club UK, no. And at some point I'll tell you a little bit about what we learned from Coffin Club. Sarah, sorry to put you on the spot, can I ask you the question that you'd said about the 10 most coffins that people are buying? What would you say what are they?
I'm frantically trying to pull up the brief that I sent them, actually. So these are not full circle coffins.
Oh, okay.
Well, I called, so I don't know, is there anyone here from JC Atkinson? So I called them, for example, and asked them if they could tell me their most commonly sold coffins, which they did. I wasn't expecting them to tell me, but they did. So I can tell you where we got to. So we got to oak, elm, mahogany, veneer, then oak veneer, solid wood, varnished and unvarnished, imported wicker, English willow, cardboard, some kind of wrap, a shroud, woolen, glitter, and life art. So that's the current brief to Planet Mark. So this would be an excellent opportunity to be told that that's ridiculous, that they were there. They seemed like it captured the range and the most frequent ones.
That's great, Sarah. Thanks. That's really helpful. Ellen, be lovely to hear from you about your beautiful coffins. And if you want to tell us a little bit, first of all, about Musgrove Willow, and then I've got a couple of things that occurred to me that I'd like to ask you.
Absolutely, no problem. Very well, welcome to everyone. It's nice to be part of the discussion. Thank you for asking me. Musgrove Willows originally started by growing willow for basket makers throughout the UK, and developed into supplying different weavers, and everybody will know the Somerset Willow Company. We used to supply them for many years. An opportunity came about and we were able to weave our own coffins amongst other items such as fence panels, etc. Historically, and at the heart of our business, is environmentally sound production of our willow. So we have now over 200 acres. Not all of it is planted into willow. Some of it is in environmentally sensitive areas and is left to or managed properly in regard to the environment, to the flora and the fauna that use it as well. So that's kind of like just basically what our business is about and how much land we have and what we do with it. We are actually undertaking a new environmental audit of the business in the next few weeks because many things have changed with the regulations according to the Environment Agency's rules, regulations, what we can and cannot have. They call it rural payments. So they give you a small amount for looking after your land in the most environmental way. We don't get an awful amount, a lot of money for that, which is, fine. But we want to ensure that what we are growing is as much sustainable and environmentally sound as is possible. And we're looking to the future in using different varieties of willow, for example, to weave our coffins and fence panels, and less impact with sprays and fertilizers, for example.
Okay. Do you sell your coffins directly to the public?
We have in the past. We have the authority of the funeral director to do so if necessary, but we always recommend a funeral director to be involved at some point. It's very difficult. We do mainly supply the trade business.
Okay, thank you. So that was one of the things that we've been very interested in at Coffin Club about what number one, what factors go into how people are choosing coffin, what factors go into how people are choosing the elements of the funeral that are having full stop. And I think what we've already heard from people here, and certainly what we learned, is that that's not necessarily top of their agenda. Environmental issues not necessarily, or indeed it's not something they initially ask until they are asked about that. And so incumbent on us to talk to people who are coming to us for our services whether environmental factors are an issue for them. Certainly at Coffin, excuse me, so for those who don't know about Coffin Club, we're basically an educational platform designed to help people explore what the funeral choices that are out there and help them to look at what their priorities might be and what they might be looking for, and to encourage people to ask questions. So that's it in a nutshell. And as demonstration purposes, what we had available for people to look at were cardboard, a flat pack wooden coffin and a shroud. And we brought those choices merely initially as a means of helping people look at personalising coffins and cost, because certainly those are the things people were coming to ask. And what we found happen was that once you start opening up the conversation, other things then become important to people, and environmental issues are one of those things. And so that has helped us, a bit like you said, Sarah, in terms of please don't use the word expert in connection with what we're doing, but it certainly has taught us a lot as well about, okay, well, where did we source those things from? I think you said earlier, James, about, so with cardboard coffins, for example, you'll come to a company that says, we are more eco-friendly than anyone else that you'll find to buy a coffin from. But, well, how do I know that? And it has made us ask questions as well as the people who come to Coffin Club. So I'm interested, I wonder if there's a couple of other funeral directors here who might be able to tell us whether environmental issues are things that people come and talk to them about if they're not asked about that. Who else is here? Funeral directors. Carrie, I know you're here. Kelly. are these are things that people are raising?
Not with me personally, but North Wales is possibly behind Manchester and London, I guess. I'm sure it'll come in the future.
From a coffin perspective, we're finding that more people are actually asking to personalise the willow coffins that we provide for them. So that's making a choice as to what colours they can put in it, or whether they have a different liner, etc. That's what we're finding with choice as well, and it does boil down to costs, I suppose, too.
Yeah, because I think that's something we really have to think about and consider, about bringing people on board, but also being very mindful that cost is a major issue for some people, and exploring how we can balance those two things. Who are there funeral directors here for who where shrouds are becoming or people are expressing more interested in shrouds or buying shrouds? Cara, thank you. Thanks.
We're just trying to promote shrouds now, to get the crematorium to test one out again, because they tested one out before and it didn't go too well. But I think we're trying to promote people making their own shrouds. I'm going to have a shroud making workshop. So yeah, you know, I think the key thing is keeping the costs down, the environmental issues, but also people wanting to be involved in personalizing something, and the cardboard coffin or a shroud works perfectly for all of that. So yeah, but I know it's not as, you know, it's not as easy, it's not as clear as that, but yeah.
Carrie, you were going to make a comment about shrouds, I think.
Yeah, I just feel like I had a tiny win recently, which was we've had a new crematorium open near us in Waisley, which is Memoria, is that right? And they're claiming to be kind of as green as a crematorium can be. And we went for a little backstage tour, and we just asked the question, would you accept a shroud as you know, instead of a coffin? And their immediate response was no. And we said why, and 2 hours later they rang us back and said we will accept a shroud. We've you know, it's kind of because we've always offered it as one of our package. Very few people go for it, but at least I like to know. I know that Julie helped us to do the first one at Redditch many years ago, so it just felt like a tiny win at that moment at that new crematorium.
I think tiny wins are good. They propel us forward to bigger wins, as we were hearing right back at the beginning of our conference from Greenpeace. Something as well that we found at Coffin Club was that we've got if we carry on talking to each other, we've got a lot to learn from different faiths and different cultures. So, you know, a classic Jewish funeral or a classic Muslim funeral, costs are kept very low, things are kept very simple, and the use of shrouds and burial are what is most normally used. And so, you know, if we talk to each other, we've got things to learn from each other about all of those factors together. Another question I was going to ask, what was it? I can't remember what it was going to be. Are there any other comments from funeral directors about what people are being asked about coffin?
Can I ask
James, yes, go on.
Yeah.
Go on.
It's about what you line the coffin with. I'm not. We at the Natural Burial Grounds, we hate the idea of coffins that are lined with creme film or plastic, because when the body's buried, this basically wraps the body and prevents natural disintegration of the remains. You end up in a basically shrink wrapped in plastic. We'd much rather calico, but people seem to be nervous of using calico or canvas inside a coffin. What do funeral directors actually do? Is this an issue for them?
Cara.
Hi, that's a really good. Funeral directors and coffin manufacturers, they all love plastic, and it's just horrendous. we ask the cardboard coffin makers to take out the creme film so we don't get them with any of that in them, and we make sure that any coffins that we get don't have plastic, and remove any body bags or anything like that, because yeah, that needs to be eradicated really. And it's ridiculous because it's not often that we have fluids emitting from every orifice, you know. It's really not as scary as people make it out to be. So yeah. And calico, and yeah, calico we use also, what do you call them, dust sheets from the building trade, you know, can be really good as shrouds.
We use the corn starch lining as well. Some people know it as an ASAP sheet. So that is environmentally friendly, and we also use calico. We don't use any glue, staples, or anything that is non-environmentally sound. Everything will degrade.
Yeah, and for people to know to ask those questions as well, isn't it? About,
absolutely,
you know, we've got this wood, wonderful. We can use this beautiful wood, natural, sustainable, but then still some screws are banged into it and glue's used, and so it's about asking.
Occasionally,
to ask questions.
We may use screws to hold things in place for transportation,
yeah, sure.
And that's what we make it very clear, because unfortunately couriers do not like or respect a cardboard box or a willow, you know, and they can push in and damage, so they are held to there, and the funeral directors are told that they are there. So it's for transportation only.
Yeah.
So they remove them when they get them, and ours are closed with wooden toggles.
Okay, Ken, you were wanting to say something. We're going to have to wrap up then.
Yes, just a quick comment. I want to remind everybody that the cheapest way forward and the most environmental is a reusable coffin, a coffin cover, because you can make it in pure wood, and because it's obviously robust, you can carry the lightest possible cardboard coffin inside, which is simply removed for cremation. It works. We tried it at Carlisle and we used it. It is easily the best way forward, because you can make a really attractive wood coffin, and then every 20, 30, 40 uses, you have to refurbish it, but that's all. It's quite simple and works.
I believe there's actually a willow one in one of the Welsh crematoriums, a reusable coffin.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, as with all the things we're talking about how we balance cost and environmental issues, and bringing people on board to at least have a conversation and to, you know, give people questions to ask that they hadn't thought of asking before, and another conversation we could have continued for the rest of the afternoon. And but sadly we have to wrap that up now. Put some more questions for any of the people that we've been hearing from, and I'll put those to them at the end of the conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jane, and thank you so much to everyone who contributed to that conversation. It's such a kind of privilege to be able to just sit and listen to experienced professional people talking to each other, and also lovely to see the interconnections between some of you who've worked with each other and inspired each other over the last few years and will continue to do so well into the future. So we've already heard from Cara, and I'm delighted to invite her back to speak now on a different topic. Cara Mayer from Arca Original Funerals in Brighton will now be in discussion with Fran about embalming. So over to you two.
Hi, Fran.
Hi, Cara.
Hi, everyone. Yes.
Just before we start on the subject of embalming, I've just put some information in the chat which I took from the report from the State of the Sector that was published by the Environmental Stewardship Group last year, just to give an idea of the scale of the impact of the funeral sector as a whole. So the stats are there, facts and figures and numbers. But embalming is not actually mentioned, which I find quite interesting, because I'm sure that there is a diminishing number of people are opting for embalming. But I don't know if you'd like to just explain your journey, Cara, from well, just tell us your story. And then
okay, very quickly, I suppose. Yeah, because I suppose it's quite unique in a way that I began in the traditional funeral world, because in 1998 I had no other option. And so I went in and started working with a co-op, and it was horrendous. Many different things happened, but I saw how not to work. But then I became interested about the role of the embalmer and physiology. So I was a trade embalmer for a little while until I started to go a bit doolally and couldn't do it anymore. And then my journey continued. And then in 2003, I opened Arca Funerals in Brighton. And since then, I have never embalmed a body to this day. And we're very, very busy funeral directors. We support funerals of broken bodies, of vulnerable bodies, of, yeah, just, and we have never refused that families should not come and view or spend time with the body or come and help dress the body. It's one of those, embalming is like a secret invasion of a dead body that none of us seem to know about. And it's only now that funeral directors have to tell a family if a body is to be embalmed, but they can still do it in a very powerful, professional way to say, it's probably the best thing, as grandma didn't look great when she died, or we'll make her look more herself, which is, it's really quite alarming, some of the language that can be used around it. And also, just embalming fluid is formaldehyde, it's carcinogenic, it's evil stuff. And the embalming process is not a soft way, it's not a gentle preparation of the body. It is, you know, the chest is pierced with a sharp trocar and body fluid pumped out, so, and then put into the sewage system. It's, I sort of feel that, you know, once someone has died and all medical intervention and everything has finished, the last thing that perhaps now people would want to happen is more metal, more cuts, more anything going on to that body. So I'm severely against it. There's no reason for it. And as I say, we've never ever, we haven't had to embalm. And just recently, we've just had a young gentleman who was repatriated back from Bali. So of course people have to be embalmed if they come by plane. And it was, oh gosh, it really took me back, because I opened his sealed coffin and just the fumes that emitted from his coffin, just horrendous, strong formaldehyde. And I had to, you know, air the place for a long time so the family could come and spend time with him. And yeah, it's not good. And embalming, I think there's this, funeral directors use embalming as a way to separate, because they bring freelance embalmers in, like I was. So funeral directors don't have to get involved with the nitty-gritty dirty work. They can still sit there and look pretty. They get the embalmer to come and embalm the body, do the hair, do the makeup, dress the body, put them in the coffin. And so sometimes, you know, the funeral director won't be involved in any part of that. And I just feel that if more funeral directors actually were more hands-on and cared more about the dead bodies that they have in their care, then families will become more involved, there'd be more work, job satisfaction from staff, and it would really change the industry.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that with everyone, Cara, because I know the background and I completely share your beliefs. And I'm thinking back to when I was working as a funeral arranger. So we're going back decades here, back prior to Arca. No, not quite prior to Arca, but a long time. And I think embalming for me, it's a euphemism. You know, it's the other ways of explaining it to families I was taught was like to talk about temporary preservation or hygienic treatment. And I know that Sarah has been doing some really interesting research into the care of the body and to the terminology that's used and the impact that that has. You know, who wouldn't want their mum to be hygienically treated, to, you know, to have that kind of euphemistic treatment that's not really spoken about in the funeral arrangement. It's just an assumption that, you know, would you like mum to be embalmed? And yeah, there's a lot of mystery about embalming, and there's a lot of expectation, I think. And then, you know, for people that aren't involved or experienced within funeral directing, it's impossible for them to understand what's involved.
Yeah. I read on the Dignity website today before I came on here, and they describe embalming as introducing a disinfectant solution to the internal environment of the body when someone passes away. You know, so there's euphemism city. It's terrible. It's, yeah, so they make it sound so gentle, and so such a wonderful thing perhaps to do for someone, so people can view someone. But I suppose what everybody needs to know is that a body does not need to be embalmed, and they can be involved in dressing that body. And yeah, that's my passion, really. That's, yeah.
Do you think that the take-up of embalming is much more for the benefit of the funeral directors? And
Absolutely.
for instance, the larger funeral directors who are processing a lot of bodies as part of a systematic way of operating, would you think that that's
absolutely
for the rise in embalming?
It takes away, like I say, the dirty work for them. You know, the bodies get done, they get clean, they get tidy, they're in their coffin, on to the next one, and then the funeral director can just continue to present themselves front of house. And you know, it's a shame it's got that way, but I think the whole funeral industry just needs to be taken apart and begun again and given back to the people. And you know, that community mortuaries, community getting involved with the dead, you know, that is the way forward. We need to take control back, really.
We're trying.
We're trying, I know, it's a bloody long road.
There's some interesting, I know we're picking up questions at the end, but just as we're talking, Toby said the key ratio is how many funeral directors continue to advise embalming. And I think that most bereaved families would not walk into a funeral director's and insist on embalming if it weren't offered to them as part of a package. I don't know.
I think it comes up, so perhaps in the discussion it would be if someone says, oh yes, they want to come and spend time with Granny, then I suppose the next part of the conversation would be, would you like us to hygienically care for her? You know, I'm not sure with the euphemism if they have to say embalm now. I'm not sure, since the CMA, if embalm needs to be used as the term, or if they can still say hygienically treated, but or hygienically cared for. But I think that's normally when it comes in to the conversation. But yeah.
Yeah, Sarah, I know that you've done some interesting research, and you may well have kind of a few words to add in here. I've got a really annoying dog in the background, so I'm just going to mute myself.
Yeah, okay, so it's quite big. So yeah, the piece of work that we did that a couple of people on the call were involved in was to try and understand people's ideas, concerns and expectations of how somebody would be cared for physically by a funeral director. And then we also surveyed funeral directors to ask actually how they cared for people and what principles drove that care. And we also looked at all of the documentation and I guess instruction and guidance to funeral directors. So that report is available on our website if anyone's interested, and there's an infographic with it. The headline is, there's very little direction to funeral directors. Funeral directors have a huge variance in their practice and in the principles that guide their practice, and people have very different expectations. It's an important but hard thing to get right. But I suppose the big outcome from that is that, I suppose from the research and where we've got to is that it would be really helpful if funeral directors started seeing their role as facilitating families' involvement in decision making. So recognizing that everybody wants different things, but that actually the key is to open the door on those important conversations and find a way that families can be involved as they want to, both in the decision making about what happens after death, but also the physical involvement. And I guess what we're kind of trying to help with is, as part of the report, there's some policies and some reflective practice documents and some guidance about supporting difficult and challenging conversations that come from GMC guidance. So other industries are doing this all the time about hard stuff. So it's not insurmountable, but yeah, that recognises that people want really different things, and the key is to find a way to enable people to be able to be involved in those decisions. I don't know if that's what you meant, Fran. It's a really big piece of work.
Yeah, like everything else this afternoon, it's it's a really big subject, and we've condensed it into 10 or 15 minutes of discussion. But I think when we were looking to set up this conference, we wanted it to be more about provoking thoughts and for people to take away different thoughts or different approaches to the very, very many elements that go into the environmental impact of a funeral. And clearly, embalming and the injection of formaldehyde-based fluids into many tens of thousands of bodies out of the 600,000 plus people who die every year, that formaldehyde is either going in the form of particle emissions up the chimneys of cremators when the bodies are cremated, or it's leaching into the ground as the body decomposes in a grave, whether it's a natural burial ground, which it really shouldn't be. But again, natural burial ground operators need to take the word of the funeral director that the bodies that they are burying haven't been embalmed, or in the case of a normal cemetery, in a coffin that may be decomposing, and the resins and the veneers and all the different elements that make up the coffin are also leaching into the soil and subsequently into the water supply. So formaldehyde for me is not something I want going anywhere near the water supply or the air that I breathe. So why it's a situation that's continuing is because nobody's making a stand and saying this needs to stop. And going back to John right back at the beginning, people have got to stand up and say no. And I think for the Good Funeral Guide to be in a situation where we're able to start this conversation and maybe start to help people to make their voices louder, to amplify voices where they are saying we are not going to do this for the following reasons, I think that it's incumbent on us to do so. So I don't know if anybody else has got anything else to say. I don't know if we've got any advocates of embalming who are joining us on this conference. It'd be really good to hear from somebody who thinks differently to the way that I think most of us feel. Can't see anybody looking that keen to be.
I'm not an advocate, just saying. A point to raise was, I live in a part of London where amongst the community, amongst major parts of the community, it is expected that one's body will be embalmed, and even if the funeral director raised that as an issue, some be significant members of that community where they'd be quite horrified for you to suggest that they weren't.
And Toby Angel has just echoed that. I think, Toby, if I'm not getting you wrong, are there cultural considerations about to embalm or not embalm?
Yeah, especially if there's a big open casket coffin, and working with a family once where the person hadn't been embalmed and there were massive family arguments, and so lots of things to consider.
Yeah, but
can I just
expectations? Yeah, sorry, Cara.
Well, just to say to that one that yes, the cultural needs, but it's all about informed choice, isn't it? And I think we can all do things because we've always done them, or mum and dad or whoever did them before. But as we move forward, there are more modern ways to be able to not embalm, and it's just about informing people of the other things that can be done, and the care and respect to the body does not need to mean carcinogenics being pumped into it.
Absolutely, totally agree.
Thank you so much. That's really, really helpful and brilliant to hear from you as well, Cara. And we're keeping to time, so I'm going to hand back to Isabel.
Lovely. Thank you, Fran. And yes, thank you so much, Cara. There's one thought forming in my mind. It almost feels like environmental choices go hand in hand with a more authentic death experience. When you start talking about using a shroud rather than a coffin, when you start talking about not embalming but caring for the body, doing the last rites yourself physically, it's an interesting thing to think about, maybe.
Yeah.
But move on we must to our next topic of discussion, and in this we have Jane speaking with Carrie Weeks. So Carrie Weeks is from A Natural Undertaking in Birmingham. And I don't know if we have Aaron Bewley here. Jane, do you know if we have?
I don't know if is Aaron Bewley still here?
He's here, but I think he's tied up with some stuff at
Okay.
home, so listening rather than contributing.
Okay, well, I'm sure there'll be other funeral directors who will contribute to this conversation. And so we have the body, it's in a coffin, it's either going to be the crematorium or the burial ground. And what do they go in? Transport. And so, Carrie, I know you're going to talk to us a bit about transport that you've got available.
I'll unmute myself, that would be a good start. I think somebody said earlier on that they feel a little bit like, I think it was Sarah said, very much not an expert on this. So this is very much I need to know what the questions are that we need to ask to get this right. The situation that me and my colleague Fran are in, we set up our company 8 years ago to try and make the process of arranging a funeral and looking after the person who's died as natural as we possibly could. And in lots of different ways, in a human way as well as an ecological way. And I think I've probably been asked to talk here because I'm one of the funeral directors who's bought an electric hearse. So we have the opportunity in a big city to provide a source of transport for the person who's died, which makes us feel that we're not adding too much emission into busy Birmingham, where we're driving around all the time. But it's not enough for us to have an electric hearse, because essentially we're still only transporting one person in one journey. And when I think about the kind of journeys we have to make, we have to ask different questions to kind of come up with the right answers about transport. So, for example, we want to be promoting and supporting people to have a natural burial wherever possible. But Birmingham is not a natural place for you to open a natural burial ground because we haven't got any green space that's available for us to do that. So every time we support a family to do a natural burial, we have a journey of a minimum of 15 miles out to our nearest natural burial ground. And we are taking probably on average 30 or 40 cars with us to do that. So we get to a point where before everybody's got an electric car, which they haven't, how can we most efficiently and kind of carbon neutrally move that group of people? So one of the things that we always offer to help families do is either a minibus or a coach. We manage lists, we've got relationships with coach companies so that at least we're only taking 1 or 2 vehicles rather than 30 or 40 vehicles out to the natural burial ground. In Birmingham itself, it's probably, I'm going to say this and I'm really sorry, but it's probably more carbon neutral or better for the environment for people to go that short distance to the crematorium, because we've got lots of crematoria right by us. So the average journey there is about 15 minutes and people aren't doing those long journeys than to go to a natural burial ground. So we've got this constant, without the data, we've got this kind of constant conversation happening. Birmingham have introduced a clean air zone, but it's only in the city centre. So we're still taking a diesel mortuary van, you know, our collection car is going into the city centre, and we're paying the little clean air zone for that. But the majority of the mortuaries that we go to are not within that space. So we're just trying to do things. There's a couple of examples where we're desperately trying to think about, not just about the transport, but the journeys that people are making. And one of the things that we're trying to do is the use of a community venue for the funeral rather than going, you know, not everybody has to go to the burial or the crematorium, but if they're going to somewhere, it's basically church, but people don't go to church anymore, but it's that model. It's the church, but we're creating new churches in local venues that people can either walk to, that are familiar to them, that create a sense of space and community and don't require everybody to drive for 40 minutes to get there. And Ken's idea of trying to get local authorities to consider, or the government to consider, the reuse of graves would work brilliantly for us here. There's hardly any burial space left in the second city. And if we could create new urban natural burial grounds, I think that would be something we'd really like to fight for and to advocate for. But yeah, we've got an electric hearse, we're trying. But all of the journeys that we're making, we're not really balancing that at the moment. I'd like some suggestions on how we can do it better.
Are people coming to you and asking about your eco hearse?
Yeah, I think people seek us out to some degree. I'm going to be honest with you, we've got it's the same, like Sarah's got a black one. It's a little Brahms Nissan Leaf that's been converted. But we like the look of it as much as the eco bit. You know, people come to us because they want something that feels less formal and traditional and a little bit more sort of soft around the edges, I think, and it does do that. And we will be getting another electric hearse. But it's the people going to the funeral that are creating the problems, not just my one dead person. Sorry, that's the reality. And instead of having funeral cars, you know, we don't ask how many cars do you want. We say who's got to get there and how are they best going to get there. Rather, you know, it's a different question at the beginning of the conversation, I think.
Yes, it's like the conversation and all the other topics we've talked about, isn't it? It's how you ask, it's what you ask.
Yeah.
How to involve people in that conversation rather than having people having it done to them. They're involved in it.
I wonder, because the streaming of funerals has become such a commonplace activity now because of being forced, you know, to do so because of COVID. But I still think you need people in a place if you can, and how you get those people to those places. Yeah, I don't know how to. I don't have any of the answers.
Questions are the place to start, aren't they?
Yeah, that's it. That's it. If the crematoria start making us drop paperwork off in person again, I will be so mad.
Leeds have done that. As of tomorrow, we'll be going to Leeds with individual bits of paperwork. So Julie, if you'd like to sort that, that'd be really great. We've even emailed like the chief exec. Ridiculous.
I don't understand that at all. There's absolutely no need for that.
Ridiculous.
That's crazy.
Of course.
I don't think Leeds are members, unfortunately, but I'll check it out.
So are the funeral directors here or arrangers or celebrants having those same sorts of conversations with families coming to you? Are they talking to you about it, or are you raising it first and then there's a conversation?
I'll chip in really briefly, just as we have. So we've had a little black eco hearse since we opened, and last year I did a little bit of kind of number crunching on why people chose it, and actually only a third of people chose it because of its environmental impact. A third chose it because it was an alternative to the traditional, so it was almost an anti-traditional Victorian car. And a third chose it because it's different and that reflected the values of the person who died. So actually, I don't know if that's good or bad, but it was only a third that chose it. And as Carrie said, it's tricky, isn't it? Because when I started looking at the data, our natural burial grounds is really quite far away. So it's about 40 minutes from our services, our natural burial ground. And then, of course, people are going to have repeated trips back to the burial ground, in contrast to maybe never going back to the crematorium because they don't like it. It starts to get really tricky, doesn't it, to work out actually what to suggest. We just need more natural burial grounds.
Can I chip in here? Because that's a bit of a myth. People who scatter ashes do it in a favorite place, and quite often they'll go back and climb that mountain, you know, on anniversaries and things. At a natural burial ground, people, they don't come back to the same extent as they do to a cemetery where there are vases to fill with flowers. They'll come back on anniversaries, but we're not busy with visitors. We get regular people who want to walk their dogs. But it is a myth that burials actually attract more mileage than cremations. And that was one of the reports that that second report that was dreamt up by the Corpse Project which I really object to.
Yeah, well, that's probably where I got that from, to be
Yeah,
fair,
probably
James, 'cause I've read all those reports.
Yeah.
Carrie, you were going to say something then?
No, it's just the same. I got, you know,
okay.
you've got that thing in your head that, yeah, I think that was the sum that was done in that report, which was, yeah, the amount of people traveling to a natural burial ground, it's a further journey, is more likely to be more damaging to the environment than, you know, lots of people going to a local crematorium and the emissions. I've got that in my head, so I must have got it from there.
Yeah, but it wasn't based on research.
No.
It was dreamt
You need
up.
research on everything.
You're absolutely right.
So you're right, yeah, and you're right, Carrie. It's I think, as I would have, you know, you have in your mind the hearse, the eco hearse, but it's about expanding it out to all of the other aspects of the funeral. And and Sarah, in terms of your point, then it doesn't necessarily mean that someone's start conversation is going to be about environmental issues, but it ultimately becomes about that, and that's a good thing. Other experiences people have of people using either eco hearses or eco limousines or eco, any different forms of transport. Cara, you were going to say something, I think. So I can only see people on one particular page, so sorry if you're on page 2 and you're putting your hands up.
I can add something which might be about direct burials and direct cremations, where the numbers of mourners attending can be reduced significantly by people choosing a direct or a very small family gathering, and also give people the opportunity to cast the funeral over the internet, so that people don't fly in from Australia and abroad to attend the funeral. Come at your normal time and spend time with the family, and perhaps join in over Zoom, but it just completely is disproportionate to the rest of the green impact of the funeral.
Cara, you were going to make a point, I think, weren't you?
Oh, I'm just going to make a different point now, but just what James said is true about the live streaming and everything. But oh my God, I had to watch a live stream during the COVID time of a friend who had died. And it was the most frustrating, awful experience, because it just felt I should have been the funeral director as well. So I was worried about the time. I was worried about people repeating themselves. I was like, there was only this one view. So I think live streaming is great, but it needs to become more immersive, I think, for people to actually really benefit, to feel that they're there and part of that farewell, really. And I can't remember what, I was just going to say Carrie's idea about the minibus is a really good idea, but obviously, yeah, there's many can of worms out there, aren't there, that we need to try and sort out.
Yeah, that's the problem with asking questions, getting people to ask questions, and there's many more things for them to sort out. Okay, I think
Jane, can I just jump in?
Yeah.
Kelly has just put a really interesting link in the chat, which is produced by JC Atkinson's and was sent to her from her local crematorium. And I think it would be helpful for James to have a quick look at that. If you've got 5 minutes, James, just have a skim through and see what your thoughts are about that. Again, going back to previous, I think it was Sarah who mentioned it earlier on, that it's data that's provided by people that have a vested interest, I think should be looked at with some scrutiny. I'll just leave it there, but thank you, Kelly, for sharing that with us.
Okay. Isabel, back to you.
Thank you, Jane. And yes, thank you again, everybody, for taking part in a fascinating conversation, frustrating at times, no easy answers, but again, yeah, the questions have to keep coming out. And interesting how this topic particularly seemed to spiral off into very different other areas of the funeral experience. For the next discussion, we'd like to invite an open discussion from all of our previous speakers on the issues of flowers, memorialisation and post-event gatherings. I noticed today, actually, only today, that the RHS has recently banned the use of floor foam, otherwise known as Oasis, from their shows. Oasis also has formaldehyde in it and is non-biodegradable. So I'd like to open the floor to all of our speakers for an open discussion on how we can go greener in memorialisation. Fran, I think you're facilitating this, is that right?
No, you are.
Oh, hooray. I'm happy to facilitate. Right. If all the speakers unmute themselves.
Can I kick off here?
Yeah, and sorry, just 1 second, James. I think also, I mean, we have 39 participants now, so if, and everyone is related in the funeral world in some way. So please do, if you have a comment to make or a contribution to make at this point on this topic, then please do feel free. I'm just going to my scene so I can see everyone at the same time. Thanks, James. Over to you.
Okay. I think vases in headstones are one of the most unenvironmental features of a cemetery, because they require to be filled, you know, and when the flowers have wilted, they need filling up again. So what people do is they put plastic flowers inside there because they don't need to be filled again, and those plastic flowers degrade in the ultraviolet into microplastics and just end up everywhere. So one of the best things that we could possibly do is to eliminate vases from from cemeteries. Perhaps someone would like to pick up and run from there.
I personally don't think it's necessarily the flowers that people take to the cemetery that's the problem. It's the masses of funeral flowers that attend the funeral that you get the big frames, plastic frames with Oasis in, saying, you know, mother, father, grandmother, whatever. They're the ones that are really polluting.
I've got one point to make, which is that the vase in a headstone is something that draws people back week after week after week. When the flowers are wilted, the flowers, you know, they're calling to be refilled, and so
not necessarily, James.
No.
I think Brendan, you and I did some research back in Cardiff, where we measured the number of flowers that were left in headstones, and we tracked over time, and we found that during the first year people do come back quite frequently, possibly weekly, possibly even more, but after about 3 years flowers are only really left on anniversaries or special occasions like Mother's Day, maybe Christmas, and after 5 years the number of fresh flowers virtually nil. So there's a natural kind of tailing off point to the flowers that are left on headstones in the cemetery. And I don't know anyone who feels that they've got to go back and put flowers because there's a vase on the memorial.
that's really interesting research.
It was interesting. Brendan, you'll remember that.
Yeah, I do remember that. I think we were getting quite a bit of flack off the family who felt that their memorial would be on the grave in 150 years' time, and the great-grandchildren would be visiting it. And we tried to explain to the British family that was probably very unlikely. But yeah, we did that research just by going out and tracking stones, and that was the case for about 3 years. The only time we'd see flowers would be Christmas, Mother's Day, and on a birthday. And I think within 10 years, certainly, there would be virtually no visits to the grave. And I think that in itself really tells us something. The memorials should not last more than perhaps 10 years. We should have something which naturally biodegrades in roughly the same time span as the average person's bereavement. I know everybody has different bereavement experiences, but it does that. There's that dropping off. And we need the memorials to end at a similar time if at all possible. And I think, Ken, you might remember, I think it was Wolverhampton, where there was, again, not at all appropriate from the point of view of the material being granite, But for the flower holders, there was like a flat tablet which could go on with an engraved rose on it, and the family could sit that on it through the winter when they didn't want to visit, again, to get away from the plastic. So I seem to recall that, but again, that was 40 years ago now. So
yes, that's true, Brendan. That was the case. Can I maybe just turn this around a little bit and say, the commercial flower industry is a nauseating business, and I wouldn't touch a flower bought in a supermarket or anywhere. The number of chemicals they use, and then put aside the fact that many plants are grown in peat, but the number of chemicals they use, especially in Africa, that's why they grow them in Africa, because there are no controls, environmental controls. So the entire flower industry has got to go through this whole looking inwards on themselves and improve themselves. So flowers per se are just vile, nauseous things.
Except the one behind me, which is growing my garden. Attracts lots of flies. I agree though, Ken, you know, that we've got to do something about that side of it. You know, I know Oasis are looking very hard at different products. They're very aware that they can't carry on producing the you know, the extruded plastic because it is so bad. So hopefully, you know, they're going to come up with some different projects. There's a lot of florists now. Is there any florists on this meeting? I've been talking to the British Floristry Association recently, and there's quite a few florists that are looking at their funeral flowers now and only sourcing local flowers, you know, British grown flowers, or sort of making use of flowers more than once as well. So they might use tributes on more than one funeral with the full knowledge of the family. Because at the end of the day, the family just want the flowers there for the funeral, and then, you know, hardly ever do they come back and inspect them or anything. So, you know, as long as there's nice flowers at the funeral, you know, whatever, you know, surely reusing them is got to be a better option than just disposing of them.
And I think living tributes are starting to be used more of flowers, you know, moss planted up and earth planted up, bulbs, yeah.
And pot plants rather than cut flowers as well.
Yeah.
So that you've got a living plant.
That maybe that raises an interesting point there, I think, because when they were using the moss frames, they were of course using sphagnum moss taken off the moors, and everybody's working hard at the moment to stop that happening. And so if there isn't an alternative like Oasis and people go back to moss, that will cause a tremendous amount of damage up on the moorlands.
Can I just say something? Is that all right?
Yes, please, Carl.
I suppose just to remember that traditionally flowers were only used to cover the smell of the body inside the coffin. You know, the flowers were used to mask any bad odors. And I think, again, as society, people feel that they have to provide these huge displays of flowers that cost so much. But I think sort of once you talk more about that, and I think it was mentioned earlier about people will give donations in someone's memory, or why not just provide single stems or bring something from your garden, and quite often it's not the flowers that people necessarily remember, it's actually the card that is attached to the flower or a card that's written during the ceremony. So I think it's just, as funeral directors, and again being the gatekeepers, you know, we do need to inform people of the different options and that they don't need to go down that road of huge waste and environmental impact. And one small thing, I suppose, is just to make sure that the families take the flowers with them from the crematorium and share them out with everybody who has attended, so they're not just left there and no one sees them. Although I suppose the rabbits and the badgers eat them, but yeah, it's a waste.
Can I just say, we've got the florist that we work with is part of a Flowers from the Farm kind of network, and she's got a lot of, she grows a lot of her own flowers. She's called Tuck Shop Flowers, but she created something with us, which is, so it's like a coffin spray, But when at the end of the funeral, we go and get it from the crematorium, and it's on a little plank, and it's like got sort of string, and we cut some strings, and it separates into 6 or 8 bouquets of cut flowers that just go away, you know, and it's just, there's no waste. Everybody gets those flowers then for a few days afterwards, and it's just, and everybody wants that. Once you explain that to people, everybody wants to do that. They don't want to leave the flowers if they've got a choice.
That's a really lovely thing, Carrie. And as you were speaking, somebody was putting in chat exactly the same, I think, idea that was happening. And it's you know, that's what's so heartening about these kinds of forums is this sense of there's the mycelium network of these ideas that are spreading and catching fire. And the more we can share them with each other, the more they spread.
I think that's you know, part of the issue, isn't it? I think everyone here today is pretty well known for their passion and commitment already. It's those who aren't here that we need to be reaching out to. It's how we attract those people.
Well, it's going to be recorded, and we'll make sure it's available. So hopefully people that haven't been able to come on a bank holiday Monday afternoon will hear that it was actually a really fascinating and inspirational couple of hours, and we'll watch it back at a later date. But you're right, you know, this conversation needs to be being had by everyone in the funeral sector, everyone in the bereavement sector, the big companies, the small companies. There's only so much that can be done individually. There needs to be more momentum. There was a very interesting, can I just put something that the other James Halliday, spelt with an I, not an A, from Caledonia Cremation. James, do you want to just unmute yourself and speak rather than me read your comment?
Yeah, Fran, with 2 John Hallidays in today, just to confuse matters. Yeah, I suppose I'm always looking at this from the perspective of funeral poverty. We were set up specifically around the topic of funeral poverty, and we waded into being funeral directors in Scotland. But really our focus was always on how we could subsidize the part of the market that has less voice. And often, I think you can see in the discussion, and I'm sorry I stepped away, so maybe you talked about costs a bit, but I think you can see in the discussion, there's loads of really good ideas, but a lot of it all comes from people who've got the privilege, and include myself in this, of having time to think about it, resources to think about what's best, about what you'd want for yourself. And when it comes to your funeral, spending a little bit more to get the right funeral for you is probably possible. Now, I'm keen to make sure there's some role in the bottom end of the market leading the way in terms of greener funerals, rather than it, you know, having the vague hope that maybe 20, 30 years down the line, the whole market might become greener. How do we empower people with less spending power, frankly, and where they have different incentives on what they would choose to spend on? How do we empower them to be part of the driving force between a greener market and funeral? So I don't have the answers particularly. My only suggestion there is around how we ask government to maybe invest in this sector via those people. I don't have all the answers, but I think that's the discussion I would like to see. How do we get it out of the kind of, frankly, we have a middle class discussion. And again, I'm completely including myself in that, and make it something that's, you know, led by what people really want across the country.
Hear, hear, John.
Yeah, Jane, you work with a number of families for whom the cost of a funeral is the most important factor.
Yeah, and so in terms of the conversation we're having, it's about trying to then introduce the elements of a funeral that, yes, are very low cost, which is part of what we've been doing in Coffin Club, but you know, its environmental impact is still low, and things that you can do for yourself that are, you know, much cheaper, and encouraging people to think about that. It's not anything to be ashamed about, and all of those factors, class and culture and money, and you know, they're all so intertwined, and bringing people on board in a way that makes them feel included and that they're still absolutely doing the best they very can for that person is really important.
Mind if I just give a parallel example from a completely different part of my life, where I'm involved in trying to campaign around how we can get people who receive the winter fuel allowance, who are facing poverty, to get additional payment in order to change to a green tariff. as a way of saying, look, it shouldn't be something that's like a nice to have extra. But if you gave consumers the choice who wouldn't normally make a choice, would literally be like, I'll just go with whatever's cheapest. And often they're only limited to 3 payers, we're saying. But like if we gave people who normally are given no choice in whether they get a green tariff or not, because it's just not on their agenda, we gave them the money and said, well, which provider in the energy sector would you choose? It might change the way the market responds. And I think the same kind of thought I've got going on here of saying, what can we do to give them the power to influence some of this a little bit as well? Thanks.
Another thing to that as well. So I think there's another piece here that I think there's an interesting dilemma for funeral care about whether this is about providing choice to people who care or whether actually our responsibility is beyond that. Because I think the reality is, yes, there's a growing sense among society that the environment matters, but I think for a lot of people, as soon as they step into the funeral space, they forget about all of that. So I think there's also an interesting conversation. It sounds like a lot of people here support people who are thinking about the environment, but actually the significant majority of people that we support, they're not. So how much are we kind of trying to manage that through the choices that we offer, and how much actually do we need to take a further step as an industry and say actually there are certain things which are just no longer going to be available because they are just too detrimental for the environment. Actually, they just have to be removed because it's not socially responsible for them to exist. Because I think, unfortunately, there's a relatively small proportion of society that when it comes to making funeral choices, the environment is on the top of their agenda. In my experience anyway, but again, I'm up north, it might be better down south.
Can I just comment on, can I comment on that?
Sure, Ken.
When we were offering DIY or family-centered funerals at Carlisle, the majority of people who took them up were middle class, and you would expect them to come driving in an Audi or a Mercedes. But when we moved over to natural burial, one thing I found that people liked about it was they felt that there was a certain cultural expectation if they did a cremation or a conventional burial, and that they could drop that when they did natural burial and actually do it the way they wanted to do it. And nobody, because there wasn't an established pattern, or the pattern was so variable that it made it easy for them to make that decision. And so even though I reminded people that if they were doing conventional burial or cremation, we allowed them, they could do whatever they wanted to do. There was no control there, but they felt that there were controls, there were expectations in society. That seemed to be one of the attractions of natural burial.
That's really interesting. Right, we have now moved on towards wrapping up this wonderful conference. We wanted to have a little section of Q&A. I think we've kind of naturally gone into that now. So I'd just like to give us another 5 minutes or so. If anybody feels that they've put a question in to the chat that hasn't been answered, or anybody has another question, then this is the time to raise it. Does anybody have a burning question for anybody?
I have a general one. Do we think that if crowdfunding, so this Planet Mark project, does anyone think, for example, if we put it out to crowdfunding, that people would, the public would step up and fund something like that? So the output of which would be some independently expert verified information about the different methods of body disposal and coffins. Do we think, does anyone have an opinion on whether it's only, well, only. So I think it'll be something like £10,000 that needs to be raised.
I've got a suggestion. And it's for organisations like the ICCM and for the Natural Death Centre and perhaps the Good Funeral Guide and others, is to try and get people to combine forces much more and get some proper academic research done so that there are statistics, there is evidence, there, you know, we have got things to work on. I really feel that's what's missing in our sector.
Are you saying that it would be independent, so it would be coming from the Crown funding would fund an independent, someone who's not attached to the funeral industry already in whatever, be it charitable, or I think that would be the way forward.
Planet Mark, maybe it sounds like maybe not everyone's heard of them. So they are an expert in sustainability and an accreditation scheme for industry, and they're a broad, they've never dealt with the funeral industry before. So they've never applied to funeral care before.
I think that's good, but shouldn't funding be from the kind of parent organizations for that independent research? Wouldn't that be a good idea?
Well, do you know what my logic a little bit with the crowdfunding is? I think there's two bits to this. There's the, well, I guess my logic is if it's funded by the public, and then there are no stakeholders that need to be carefully managed initially.
Yeah.
You've just got a no agenda sort of, you know, here is the big question. You've said it will cost £10,000. Here you go. And the only ask is that it's publicly available because it's been funded by the public. So that's the logic. My worry, and it's no, you know, all of the organisations that you've mentioned are fabulous, but then, you know, there'll be other organisations who I think have a reason to then want to kind of try and have an impact on the process and therefore potentially discredit the outcome.
I think it's good. I think it might actually help disrupt things as well if it doesn't come from the institutions.
But there's also, the institutions could contribute to the crowdfunder, couldn't we? So we could make a contribution, but without any expectation of being credited.
Yeah.
And I think we'd be very happy to, or very interested to talk about that.
And I've specifically asked actually that so it costs a little bit, the consultant will cost about 8,000, and specifically said that it needs to be Planet Mark who manages the process. So there is no funeral care professional who is in any kind of steering capacity, because it's almost like extra money is being paid for Planet Mark to manage it. So there's no one who has any kind of power in the room, as long as the public pay, because that's where it gets tricky. If anyone sticks £1 in, we'd only need another 9,000.
I think it's a great idea.
Okay, I'm just going to ask some of the questions that are in the chat, because a couple of things have come up here. James mentioned the survival of trees planted. Could he just please repeat that as I missed it? From David Ledger.
13% of trees, according to a European forestry report, grow to maturity. That depends on having good aftercare and the proper protection against deer and rabbits. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, James. From Amandine, and I can't see the surname. Sorry, Amandine. I'd love to hear some thoughts on what would need to change culturally or logistically for natural organic reduction, human composting, to gain acceptance in the UK. Who'd like to take that? Maybe Ken kick us off on that? What would need to change culturally or logistically for human composting to gain acceptance in the UK?
Sorry, was that for me?
Yes.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, I might have a view on that.
I don't think that situation is quite as easy as it sounds, because after you've reduced the body through composting, you end up with a certain amount of soil, very rich soil, and you've got to do something with it. And people in America, certainly, they're taking it and putting it onto a natural reserve. Now that rich soil will completely change the ecology on that site. Now, some people are taking the soil to put into a private garden, and it's a cubic meter. We're looking at quite a lot of soil potentially. So the process isn't complete. The complete process is the disposal of the soil afterwards, just the same as you have to dispose of cremated remains. And the worst place you can put cremated remains is on a mountain, because they move down the mountain, they change the ecology completely. So this very rich soil needs somewhere to go. Ideally, it should go on, say, a farmer's field somewhere. But apparently, because there might be prions or something in the soil, I don't think they'll allow that with agriculture. And so I do think that they need to think this process right through to its completion. I don't like these processes whereby they talk about doing, say, resumation, but you still end up with a great pile of organic material and it needs to be disposed of. And this rather casual thing, oh, we'll take it and we'll put it on a natural burial site. But if I have a natural burial site and I'm wanting to grow, say, silver birch, the last thing it wants is rich soil. It wants relatively poor soil, the sort of normal soil it finds out there. So that's my only comment. Other than that, I think the idea is perfectly sound and could work. And especially areas where I am here in Derbyshire, you can't dig in the ground because there's solid limestone right underneath the surface. But the farmers up the way have empty barns and they could take 100 pods tomorrow. And 100 bodies could be decomposing over, say, 2 or 3 months. And if that soil could go onto their fields where they're growing crops, no problem. It would work ideally.
Great. Thank you, Ken. It's very insightful. And final question, a lovely question for us to finish on together as we close down and move on with our lives and think about what we can do to affect change and to go greener. If we're all going to facilitate change, what's the very best one we can all start with as first option in the view of the experts in today's room? So it would be lovely to hear, from everyone who's spoken today with just one thing that we can do. Here's a wonderful share from Fran. This infographic is really good. But if we could hear from our speakers as well, that would be great.
Oh, for goodness sake. Oh, I'm trying to turn my camera on. You probably heard me swearing there. Sorry, everyone.
It wasn't bad swearing. I've heard worse.
I get so blasé about these calls. From Greenpeace's point of view, there are so many things we could do, but to first of all recognise that the two major things that impact the climate are still burning of fossil fuels and also agriculture, commercial agriculture. And so coming back to Ken's point about the use of soils, of the natural media that we use to grow our food is very important. The best thing you could do, I think, is become a vegetarian, ideally vegan. And of course, just get rid of these awful fossil fuels. Make it, and that's, well, not every, that's an easy thing to say, very difficult of an individual to do, of course, but keep banging on about it, keep pressuring the decision makers, our leaders of our country, to actually make the changes, identify who can make the change, and don't let them relax. Make sure they stick to it, the promises they've made. When Boris Johnson says he's not going to drill in the North Sea, make sure he damn well doesn't.
Yeah.
No, I'll stop there, otherwise I get too carried away.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
I've got a suggestion, which is to keep things modest, not to be ostentatious with things, to think about the impacts of your choices, and do as much as you can yourselves.
Okay.
Thanks, James.
Could I come in just on one point?
Oh, sorry.
Yes, Ken, of course.
Could I come in just one point? If all crematoria went over to the ICCM Trust work to develop environmental cremation, whereby we hold over coffins, we only operate a cremator when we have at least 8 or 10 bodies to cremate, and a single cremator is run for a minimum 12 hours, and we can see somewhere between 40% and 60% reduction in gas usage. No private crematoria are doing that, and only a handful of public crematoria are doing it. But it could be done tomorrow.
I would agree, Ken, and I think we need a strategic overview of cremation in this country. Why are we still building lots of new crematoria when we've got massive capacity anyway? Do we need to keep building new sites? So I think we need an overarching view, possibly some government intervention to say, you know, it's not sustainable to keep building new sites.
And we need the data, don't we, to lobby. We need the data, really reliable data on how bad some of these things are and how viable the alternatives are, so that we could mobilize, not me, but someone like the ICCM can mobilise and lobby. You can't lobby without the data.
Working on it. I think the other thing is to all of us to have conversations with as many people as possible. I mean, I'm always talking to people that I meet about my work, and I think just people are so ill-informed about funerals generally and about the impact on the environment, and just have those conversations wherever you can. Let's start the change from the bottom up, almost, by telling people what it's all about. I think that's what my one change would be that, I think.
I think there was something that John said right at the beginning about Greenpeace finding you never know where you're going to find your allies. Is that the constant conversations and keeping this going is you don't know where those impacts are going to be most clearly felt. It's just about, like Julie said, just keep talking to people about it.
Yeah. Fabulous. Well, look, we've come to the end of our extraordinary 2.5-hour conversation. Thank you everyone so much for taking part. Every single speaker has been fascinating, passionate, informed, and there are so many further conversations to be had. I know that me, Fran and Jane will be thinking about, what we do with all of this information, what our next step is, what best platform the Good Funeral Guide can provide to make sure that these conversations continue and that actions can be taken. If any of you want to email us with any thoughts or feedback, then please do feel free. Let's keep this alive. Let's be those people that never give up, that look in the smallest, strangest places for support when we feel we don't have any. Let's be each other's support. And thank you again for giving up your Bank Holiday Monday for such a crucial and important conversation. Fran, Jane, do you want to say anything?
Just thanks, everyone. It's been absolutely brilliant. I can't believe it's 2.5 hours. It's flown by. And that's because of the calibre of the contributions. So for all of our speakers and for everyone that's been listening and asking questions, thank you.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I've learned so much this afternoon, and luckily I've got lots of Coffin Club workshops coming up in the next few weeks. I'm going to take it all there.
And I did also want to say a big thank you to two of our patrons who are here today, to Ken West and to Zenith Virago. We couldn't do this without you. Thank you.